Good afternoon. I'm Reina Kaneko, President of the Japan-America Society of Hawaii, or JASH. Thank you for joining us today. This afternoon, we will have a discussion on the China-Taiwan relationship and what role does the US and Japan play in it. Before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping items. The program today is in Zoom webinar format, which means we will only see the guest speakers on screen. We welcome your questions and will entertain them after the speakers have completed their presentations. Please type your questions into the Q&A box. I'd like to thank the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, or APCSS, for partnering with us on today's program. APCSS is a Department of Defense institution and one of 5 regional security study centers that address regional and global security issues. APCSS supports US Indo-Pacific Command by developing and sustaining relationships among security practitioners and national security establishments throughout the region. At this time, I would like to introduce the Director of APCSS, Admiral Pete Gumataotao, to open our program.
Aloha, Reina, and aloha, Japan-American Society of Hawaii members. Really honored to have this opportunity to say a few words. I know I've looked at the title. It's a really great topic you have picked. And it's really good to see that Major General retired Suzanne Vares-Lum will be speaking to you about what's going on currently and what we're going to do ahead, and how we have an APCSS professor, Dr. John Hemmings, who's an awesome professor here, providing you some insight as to how we get here and see the connective tissues. I just want to say that what you do in your organization, the Japan-America Society of Hawaii, you're trying to get together and build understanding and foster this relationship is awesome. I know people probably tell you that, but sometimes you ask yourself, why is this so important? Because the better we get together to understand, the more we build respect, and the more we can find opportunities, instead of finding excuses, why not to work and collaborate and work together. And so as we think about the Northeast Asia region, think about Japan, US, and the Republic of Korea Trilateral Alliance. That is, oh my gosh, there's so many opportunities there to do what? To continue to promote stability. And if you have stability, you will have prosperity. So we really look forward to hosting the Japan-American Society of Hawaii down here at the center. I got Jim Harai, my trusted deputy, sitting in the room behind me. So you've got an inroad, right? Anytime you need it, as soon as the COVID restrictions are lifted, please, Reina, bring your here, and we can even gather more faculty folks to have a wonderful exchange of views and ideas with you all. So thank you again for the opportunity to say a few words. I salute you all and enjoy our 2 speakers. They're going to be great. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Admiral Gumataotao, for the invitation back to APCSS. We were there in 2017, thanks to Jim Hirai, and we'll be looking forward to being back there again. So thank you for the invite. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Reina. He's right here taking notes. He's down here taking notes. He's ready to take you guys on. Thank you.
Hey, Jim. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, our moderator for today is none other than Ms. Barbara Tanabe, owner of Hoʻakea Communications and also a JASH board director. Barbara, I know you don't want me to say this, but she's an Emmy-winning news anchor, and her career, her very illustrious career, has taken her from being a news reporter to a news anchor, and then on to becoming a top public affairs professional. So thank you so much, Barbara, for doing this for JASH. That's her second job, as she reminds me all the time, working for JASH. And welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Reina, and thank you very much, Admiral, for the invitation and your support. I'd like to briefly introduce our two panelists today. You've already seen their bio on the website, and I think it has also been distributed to you, so I won't go into great detail, but we are really honored to have retired General Vares-Lum and Dr. Hemmings to focus in on the topic today. And the topic is the importance of the US-Japan alliance when we look at tensions in the South China Sea, such as what we see between China and Taiwan. Of course, everyone calls it a China-Taiwan relationship, but I think it's a little bit more tense than that. And I wanted to start out with something that everyone seems to be aware of today, and that is this novel that was recently published. It's called 2034. It was co-written by Admiral James Stavridis and his partner, Elliot Ackerman. And it is about a world war, and it happens in 2034. The war is between China and the United States, with China being supported by Iran and Russia. And what happens really stems from a naval battle that occurred near Taiwan, and that quickly escalated. So what we'd like to do is discuss the situation today. Admiral Stavridis recently talked about his book and why he chose the topic and why the players that he mentions in the book. And he says it's because what he tried to do was think about where we are today. And if we do not change or we do not improve relationships, what might happen in the future? That's why he came up with 2034 and a world war. So if we come back to today, where are we today? What is the situation? And that's what we want to talk about, and the importance of how the US-Japan alliance can prevent the occurrence of a hot war if we can just get through some of the tensions today. So with that, I'd like to call first on Dr. Hemmings to give us a framework of the situation today, and then we'll turn quickly to General Vares-Lum to discuss the military operational readiness of the US and Japan forces. So Dr. Hemmings, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tanabe, and thank you to JASH for inviting me to speak. I'm very honored to speak in front of Major General Vares-Lum, who has great experience in the US-Japan alliance. So my job in the next 10 minutes or so is to kind of set up the structural issues of why Taiwan is important to the US-Japan alliance. And so I'll do that with some very brief slides, which I'll take you through, which I believe are going to be shared now. So yeah, next slide, please. So just, a brief look at the future of the US-Japan alliance. If we think about from 1996, when President Clinton and Prime Minister Hashimoto met and did the joint declaration, I'd say a lot has changed between now and then in the alliance. The threat environment has changed considerably. We have the gray zone operations in the maritime. We have the Taiwan issue. We have below threshold attacks. And then the organizational adaptation. The alliance is trying and struggling to adapt itself in terms of how it organizes. We've also extended ourselves out with the Quad, with Japan, US, Australia, and India, beginning to act like a quasi-alliance. We've heard discussions about Japan maybe joining the Five Eyes. That's been a long kind of back and forth debate. And then of course the D10, which is the British proposal to enlarge the G7 by adding a number of states. And that's a technology group that includes the US-Japan alliance. So next slide, please. So that's kind of the area, but Taiwan is a central issue. And why is it a central issue? Taiwan is a central issue to the US-Japan alliance because of Japan's sea lanes of communication. Japan has long been a country at very little minerals or gold or silver, very little in terms of rubber, very little in terms of what we would think as natural resources, very little in terms of energy, natural energy resources, liquid natural gas or fossil fuels. And yet it is the third wealthiest country in the world. How has it done that? It has become a huge importer of raw materials, a manufacturing superpower that then exports these processed goods. And so it is vitally dependent on Japan to have access to the sea lanes. This is what Dr. Ewan Graham, a great scholar who is at IISS at the moment, he calls it Japan's difficult strategic geography. And so if it's Japan's problem, it's also the US's problem. And that is just a fact of the US-Japan alliance. Now, the United States has other equities in Taiwan, but just for today, I want to focus a little bit on those that relate to Japan and its sea lanes. So next slide, please. If you look at this map, you'll see these are essentially the red lines are the greatest concentrations of shipping. And as you can see, if we look at Japan right up there in Northeast Asia, we see a very, very busy amount of traffic between itself, Southeast Asia, Australia, where it gets a lot of its liquid natural gas, about 40%, and then much to the Middle East, where it gets nearly 80 to 90% of its fossil fuels, much of it from Saudi Arabia and UAE. And much of that has to go through the South China Sea. So again, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, all of these issues are to Japan hugely important. They're also very important to the United States. The United States has a maritime order. All of its allies rely on getting their energy from the Middle East. It has long been, through the US Navy, a guarantor of those countries being able to rely on that supply. And so any danger of that route to Japan is also a danger to the US-Japan alliance. And Taiwan is smack dab in the middle of that, particularly with its ports that face towards the Pacific, deep water ports, which if they were in the PLA's hands, would make China's potential stranglehold on Japanese imports and trade exports very precarious indeed. Next slide, please. So, you know, we think about this as a new event. No, this goes right back to when Japan emerged from the Meiji era into the modern age. And it almost immediately began to imitate the Western powers, which were imperial in nature, had coaling stations and large navies. And it also began to develop and build a overseas empire in order to not only give itself access to these raw materials, rubber, oil, and these fossil fuels, but also it built a navy to continue to control and at least guard against the takeover of these sea lanes of communication. You have a picture there of Shimoseki, the Treaty of Shimoseki. This is when Taiwan was wrested from the Qing dynasty in 1895. And this was a great moment when Japan felt more at ease, that it was beginning to establish control over these very vital sea routes. So although Japan has changed and become a liberal democratic society, we can see that the geography, the strategic geography has remained the same. It's how Japan, Taiwan, and the United States must think through these relationships and these dependencies. Next slide, please. So if you look at how the United States and Japan think about Taiwan together, historically, the Yoshida Doctrine in 1951, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, essentially all of us more or less who work on Japan and the US know the deal. The deal was, Prime Minister Yoshida, the first prime minister after the war, wanted Japan to remain a pacifist country. That was built into the Constitution. He avoided a multilateral alliance grouping that the US was at the time tentatively considering. And instead, a bilateral alliance was built in which the United States would be able to project its forces forward into Japan. And the deal was to defend Japan and its interests. In other words, the United States Navy would take over the job that the Imperial Navy had. And that went very well for the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. It's a very successful and one of the longest lasting alliances in history. 1996, as I say, the end of the Cold War, and you have Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Hashimoto begin to reconsider and renew the alliance. They're trying to figure out what's next. And in the 1990s, you had the Taiwan Strait crisis. And at that time, I think the United States and Japan had both felt in the 90s this kind of euphoria, post-Cold War euphoria. It's the economy, stupid. Everything was going to get better. It was about commercialism, multilateralism, old alliances were a little bit fusty. And the Taiwan Strait crisis, where the PRC essentially fired a number of missiles into the waters around Taiwan and tried to coerce and threaten it, was a reminder to leaders in both Tokyo and Washington that there was still the Taiwan issue. It remained a significant kind of structural issue, and that as long as Taiwan was democratic and free, the US and Japan not only had national interests in defending that space, they also had normative and values interested. And so that joint declaration says that in the areas surrounding Japan, that they would work on that. And then those little phrase right there, in the areas surrounding Japan, it's kind of vague, but that was understood at the time that Taiwan was mentioned in that. And at the time, we know the Australians also had that internal debate. And in the end, they also did commit to the defense of, or at least support of US defense of Taiwan. And then 2012, you begin to see the rise of the Senkaku East China Sea issue. Again, undersea gas, LNG fields there, a big priority for Japan, but also the sea lanes that go down to Southeast Asian markets and Middle Eastern gas. The United States reassures Japan that the Senkakus fall under Article 5 of the treaty. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this is where the Senkaku Islands is. You can see how close it is to Taiwan. And you can also see where these dotted lines show the different claimed EEZs, exclusive economic zones. Japan's is green, China's is red, so they overlap. This is not that they are both deliberately being obtuse, but actually this is a part of a problem of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. It depends which claim you have. So both are somewhat legitimate, and when they overlap like that, they're supposed to meet in the middle, but neither country has done that. Anyway, we can see also the gas fields and the drilling platforms, all of that very critical for Japanese security, but also links up the Senkakus to Taiwanese security, and why Japan has got a pressing national interest in both, and why the United States has a pressing interest in both. The Senkaku Islands look like a laughably small place to start a war over, but it's not just the islands in themselves that are important. It's how to defend Taiwan's flank and how to keep those shipping lines open for Japan. Next slide, please. And so as you can see, the rise of China under Xi Jinping, under the Marxist-Leninist Party, you know, China's become an extremely wealthy country, the second largest economy in the world, and it has begun to spend money on military capability. And it has these missile capabilities. You can see the anti-ship cruise missile bubbles there that are very over Taiwan and over the Taiwan Strait. You can see the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile range, which goes all the way over to Guam and a potential carrier killer. And so you can see that this anti-access area denial is beginning to threaten Japan's access to Middle Eastern oil, Australian LNG, and is beginning to be an exertion of what Mahan, the great American naval thinker, would call sea control. It may be from the air, but it controls what's on the sea. So that has become a major issue. And of course, it's about Taiwan, but it's also about Japan. And I think, in a sense, China's strategy, both in the South China Sea and in Taiwan, is to control those areas until Japan finally submits and realizes the inevitable, that they are beholden to Beijing in order to get their gas and energy. In order to have trade, they have to rely on Beijing. So it's a kind of coercion without war. You know, it's a win without fighting. Perfect Chinese strategy, all very, very surrounding it, like the game Go. Next slide, please. This is why it is troublesome for all of us to think about Taiwan. It looks like a lot of numbers, but I'll just tell you quickly. The green is people in Taiwan who identify as Taiwanese. You can see green from 1992 to 2020 is just going up, 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 up. The black, which is, the dark blue is Taiwanese people who believe themselves who identify as Chinese, and that is going down, 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 down. And meanwhile, the both Taiwanese and Chinese is somewhere in the middle. So, you know, Beijing is on a timeline. This is happening. People are becoming more Taiwanese in Taiwan rather than Chinese. Next slide, I believe it's the last. where are we now? Very quickly, you know, Xi Jinping has been very forceful in talking about unifying with China and Taiwan. He said foreign interference is intolerable and all necessary measures will be taken to reunify with the nation. And then, of course, in April of this year, President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Suga have underscored the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So we are now blinking eyeball to eyeball at each other. And that is, I believe, my last slide. So with that, I have run out of time and it's been a pleasure. I hope that was helpful and useful. And I look forward to the remaining discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hemmings. What a wonderful way to frame things and describe the situation today. Now I'd like to turn over to the military side, specifically what the United States sees happening in this area. And before we get to General Vares-Lum, I might add that in the last 2 years, China has violated Taiwan airspace 280 times this year alone, which is more than double what it had been in the last 2 years. So it seems like, you know, it's more than eyeball to eyeball. It's really getting pretty hot there. So let me turn it over to General Vares-Lum.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barbara Tanabe. It's an honor to be on this panel with Admiral Gumataotao and Dr. Hemmings from APCSS. I'm a fan of all of you, APCSS and Barbara Tanabe, for sure. And if I could have the slides up, please. And thank you, the Japan-American Society of Hawaii with Reina. I appreciate you inviting me today. You know, I've served at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command for over 5.5 years, and I just officially retired actually 2 days ago. I've served under 2 commanders, Admiral and Ambassador retired Harry Harris, who is really the first American admiral of Japanese ancestry to serve as the commander of this combatant command, and also Admiral retired Phil Davidson, who of course was able to usher in, and I was able to see our new commander, Admiral John Aquilino, who I worked a lot with at Pacific Fleet. You know, to understand the role of the US-Japan in the Taiwan-China relationship, I'm going to speak, as Barbara had mentioned, from a military to military perspective. But I first wanted to share about our US military presence in the region. If I could have the next slide, please. Some of you may or may not know some of the characteristics, but I think it's important to mention because it puts it all in context. So I really appreciate Dr. Hemmings really narrowing down on what was happening there. But the challenge that we have as a military is that this is the largest and oldest combatant command. And it's from California coast to the west coast of India. We like to say, or Admiral Harris used to say all the time, Hollywood to Bollywood, polar bears to penguins. We deal with 36 nations, over 50% of the world's population, 14 time zones, the largest country, China, and the largest democracy, India. 60% of global GDP contributes to more than 2/3 of the global economic growth. We have 5 nuclear armed states in this region, 5 of the 7 US bilateral treaty allies, and of course, Japan being one of them. And Dr. Hemmings mentioned, you know, the major challenge, of course, is a PRC, but we also have others, and so does Japan. Some of them are much the same. The PRC, of course, #1, Russia with their Pacific Fleet. And if you go to Japan, you'll see that that's another challenge that they have, as well as the DPRK, and for us as well, the violent extremism. Other things we've seen, COVID-19, climate change, border conflicts, natural disasters, and of course, the economic planning of Russia throughout China throughout the region. So PRC, as mentioned, represents our greatest strategic challenge for both the United States and Japan. And as Dr. Hemmings mentioned, China's rapidly advancing capabilities and increasingly competitive posture, you know, in order to be the regional hegemon is certainly very evident, as Ms. Tanabe had mentioned. The PRC's adopted an increasingly assertive military posture to all of its neighbors, particularly Taiwan. And over the past year, the PRC has used all the instruments of their national power to isolate Taipei from the international community and compel unification, and they've made it quite clear. All of last year, they amplified their force posturing near and around Taiwan to include H-6 bombers to circumnavigate the island and conduct Taiwan Strait centerline crossings, flying military aircraft into the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone, or the ADIZ, at the highest rate in nearly 25 years. They've also incorporated highly publicized amphibious assault training into national level exercise to put pressure really on Taiwan and to message their resolve. Further, Beijing is advancing its territorial ambitions in the East China Sea, and it consistently uses its Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard to press its sovereignty claims in and around the Japanese-administered Senkaku Islands, to test Japan's resolve as well as our resolve, and of course, creating tensions in Northeast Asia, although they claim that we are. PRC ships conducted presence operations in the contiguous waters around the Senkakus for a record 333 days in 2020. And that's an increase of nearly 20% from 2019. And in June 2020, Beijing unilaterally named 50 geographic features in the East China Sea, a number of which are near the Senkaku Islands. I want to talk a little bit about our vision, our joint vision, which I believe it complements each other. While not one and the same, they subscribe to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan does, as we do, committed to that peace and prosperity of the region. We both are committed to open access to the commons, to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. We're committed to free and fair trade, shared access to global markets, good governance, and human rights and civil liberties. That's a joint vision that we both possess. And I want to talk a little bit about how our relationship with Japan fits into our US strategy and vice versa. While their strategy differs somewhat in their free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, there is a lot of overlap. There are 4 lines of efforts in our US strategy, and they're listed here on this slide. You know, increasing our joint force lethality, that our ability to warfight that deters the PRC, as well as enhancing our design and posture, meaning where we're located and how we design that together. Strengthening our allies and partners, and not just US, Japan, but all of our allies and partners in the region, as well as modernizing our exercises, experimentation, and innovation programs. Next slide, please. And it's clear by these pictures here, and the most recent top left, Admiral Aquilino with Prime Minister Suga this week was his first regional trip, just as Secretary of Defense Austin at the end of April, and Admiral Davidson with General Yamazaki on the bottom left, and the bottom right with Admiral Harris and Admiral Kawano. These are key relationships. The first trips that each one of them have made have been to Japan, and that's key signal and messaging. And Admiral Aquilino said, and I'm going to quote him, it says, "It was important that I visit Japan as part of my first overseas trip to listen and learn from our allies about their security concerns in the region." He said, "The US-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of peace and security in Indo-Pacific. And we remain absolutely committed to working alongside Japan and other like-minded countries to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific, where all nations can thrive and prosper." So I think it's key that we've heard things key, critical, cornerstone, in order to deter our adversaries. Japan, of course, has to deal, as I mentioned, with DPRK and Russia's Pacific Fleet, but China's assertive actions, as we see, is on the rise. And Prime Minister Suga agrees, as you see in the press recently, it says, agrees with the US to reinforce deterrence. Deterrence has been defined many ways. And for us, it's capability. Do you have the capability? And number 2, do you have the resolve? And that means deterrence. Those 2 things together, US and Japan, in order to do that, allows Beijing to open up, and Admiral Davidson would say this quite often, open up the curtain. Xi would open it up and look that today is not the day. So they've deterred those kinds of actions that would threaten our free and open Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. So the Japan Self-Defense Forces, in the context of those 4 lines of effort that I just mentioned, in terms of joint force lethality, we've seen significant self-defense force investments by Japan. You know, they're now active in overseas missions, and including efforts throughout the past 20 years to help us in Afghanistan, reconstruction in Iraq, the Japanese military contributions to global operations like counter-piracy patrols, they relieve some of the burden on the US military to manage the diverse security challenges, as well as the Self-Defense Force has advanced capabilities to complement our forces. And we've seen this with anti-submarine warfare, integrated air missile defense, 5th generation fighters, Aegis destroyers, as well as their own organic surface to ship missile systems that they've developed, as well as space and cybersecurity investments. The government approved a record defense budget for fiscal year 2021, $51.7 billion, really to introduce new capabilities. And I think this is significant, and it sends a significant message. So it's not just budget, it's not just investment in hardware, but it's also structure. They recently added the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, and this is an elite maritime unit. And their mission is to conduct amphibious operations and to recover any Japanese islands taken away by adversaries. The other piece is readiness. They have improved their readiness drastically. As I said, I've been there 5.5 years, and I've seen an incredible increase in the training and bilateral planning and execution with Japan. And I remember a long time ago, a Yamasakura exercise. It was in the late 1980s in Hokkaido. The difference between then and now is significant because of that bilateral training that we've done and multilateral training. The second area we see change, of course, and an increased investment and partnership is the design and posture piece. Indo-PACOM posture pretty much hasn't changed a whole lot since World War II, focused on Northeast Asia, Japan being key in that. And all of the activities for Indo-Pacific Command, headquarters right here in Hawaii. So if you think about the tyranny of distance, Japan posture is critical for the United States as well as Japan. So under the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, Japan grants the US Armed Forces the use of land and facilities in Japan in exchange for US military support for the defense of Japan. And currently we have approximately 54,000 US troops under the command of our US Forces Japan Commander, Lieutenant General Kevin Schneider. And really, we postured there our most capable and advanced forces. Also, the US and Japan forces, in terms of design and posture, have moved to co-locate some of their command facilities in the recent years, which really allows for increased coordination and communication through this integration. And this is just a representation of that advanced bilateral cooperation. Also, from these bases, it's allowed us to do freedom of navigation operations, transiting through the Taiwan Strait, as well as intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities and exercises. The third area, allies and partners. As I mentioned, it's really key to deterring China's military advances, because one advantage we have is that we have allies and partners. And I think it's not just, again, as I mentioned, the United States and Japan, but it's also deepening that trilateral security cooperation with South Korea and Japan, as well as the quadrilateral security dialogues with India and Australia. And that is moving forward. And that took a while, but it's very promising, as well as working together to expand capacity building in Southeast Asia and Oceania. Japan and the United States together are taking lead roles. And the fourth area that we see Japan increasing is exercises, experimentation, and innovation. We see, as I mentioned, increased complexity, operations, including a lot more in the complexity of their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as well as transiting. And the other piece is bilateral planning. We've come together not just for future planning, but crisis planning mechanisms, such as the Alliance Coordination Mechanism. And I'm really happy to say that I've been a part of a lot of that. And a lot of these key exercises like Keen Edge, which is a CPX with the Japan Joint Staff that has about 6,000 participants, and Keen Sword, which is also an air wing and fleet level exercises, has about 20,000 participants. And I want to share what General Yamazaki had said, that really he is the Chief of Staff for the Japan Joint Staff for the Japan Self-Defense Force. He said the lessons learned from these challenging exercises will pay great benefits in the future, affecting not only our bilateral plan, but also that of the Japan Self-Defense Force readiness. And that this conduct of the bilateral exercise really sends a very powerful message to Japan's commitment to regional security, and which is growing every day. So to ensure this all happens, we now have liaison officers in our headquarters for all the services: Pacific Fleet, Pacific Air Forces, US Army Pacific, Marine Forces Pacific, as well as Special Operations Pacific. And that is growing every day. Next slide. So really, we are proud of our partnership, our mill-to-mill, military-to-military partnership with Japan. These are just a few pictures, just examples of investments, hardware, readiness, training, and exercises that I discussed. On the top left really is the Rim of the Pacific exercise with the Aegis destroyer Ashigaya, which came out, although it was offshore Hawaiian Islands because of COVID, it shows their commitment. These bilateral sales happen quite often. On the top right, you see the investments in fighter jets, 5th generation fighters. This picture actually is the first female fighter pilot in Japan, First Lieutenant Misa Matsushima. And she is their first fighter pilot, very exciting. On the bottom left, you see the P3 intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities there around the Senkakus, as well as the bottom right, the training of their amphibious rapid deployment brigade, definitely sending a message that they're trained and ready. Next slide. So what's next? So I think we need to continue to assure our allies around the region, not just Japan, by promoting regional cooperation, and Japan can play a significant role in that, and they have been, and I think they will, I believe they will continue to do so. Also building partnership capacity in the region, including Oceania. Some other things to think about that has been discussed lately is really liberalizing the rules for military equipment export from Japan. And I think that's an area next to tackle, as well as expanding the scope for the self-defense force missions. And those are, while controversial, something that perhaps is the next conversation. But with that, I will conclude there. I apologize, I went over a little bit, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General Vares-Lum. Both the General and Dr. Hemmings did a wonderful job setting things up very comprehensively of the situation that exists today. And now we're going to go to questions from our audience. And going back to, first of all, Dr. Hemmings, you had put up a map on the shipping lanes that currently exist today. And one area that is opening up is a question from Leslie Ozawa. The Arctic route has been growing exponentially because of the warming climate. There's more room now for ships to transit. What is that going to do as far as affect the relationship that the US has with its allies and the pressure that is Russia's putting on the presence of its fleet here in the Pacific?
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you very much for the question, Leslie Ozawa. I think it's a superb question because it understands implicitly the connection between the South China Sea and the Arctic. If you think about it from a purely naval point of view, they are the two authoritarian powers, China and Russia, are essentially securing the only trade routes between the wealthy market of Europe and the manufacturing production of Asia. It is a incredible heist, bank heist, and they're doing it quietly and slowly, primarily through legal measures such as requiring, they're changing international law. And the system, of course, that for the last 400 years has been mare liberum, open seas, which was an idea put forward by the Dutch legal scholar Grotius. And this mare clausum, or closed seas, is a way of controlling sea lanes for your own gain. Now, I think it's a very, very smart question because you understand implicitly that they are doing this. It's just happening very slowly. So we're not reacting it to the same way that we did to events in the Second World War, where it was very sudden. But thank you for the question, and I absolutely agree with the connection.
And I think that Admiral Stavridis also realized that when in his novel, he made it very clear that the Russians and the Chinese were in bed together. I mean, they know how to create synergy and support each other and oppose the United States and whatever it does. So thank you very much for that question. We have another one from Daniel Ferguson. And his question is more of a, I guess if we have a hot war, if China were to invade Taiwan, what do you think would be the reaction of our trading partners? And for him, because he is in higher education, many of our universities have very close ties with universities both in Japan and in China. So if there's an invasion, how will that affect other parts of our communities? So perhaps we'll go to General Vares-Lum for that question.
Thanks for that question, Daniel. I think it certainly would put pressure on speed and swiftness to conclude any kind of conflict. If China were to invade Taiwan, there would be very little appetite. And this is one of the factors that, I think for consideration as we look at planning, there would be little appetite to have a prolonged crisis. A de-escalation and off-ramp opportunities would have to be, we would have to set the condition from a military perspective to off-ramp this very quickly. This kind of long-term prolonged crisis, our partners, I don't think would tolerate it very much. And it would definitely, from our perspective, when we talk about access and basing, whether it's overflight, whether it's logistics, we rely on those trading partners throughout the region. And if there isn't a quick conclusion to something like this, I think it would be very difficult for us. So those are some of the considerations as we look at that from a military perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Hemmings, what about from your perspective, the soft power perspective?
Yeah, on the second part of the question on educational diplomacy, I have to say I'm very, coming from academia myself, I'm very in line with that. It's a regret that the academic realm would be affected. But frankly, Xi Jinping has been really pushing an authoritarianism that has seeped into a lot of Western universities. Remember, Cambridge University Press was going to restrict its publications. Springer House has restricted their publications. All of this to be in line with Chinese law. And so unfortunately, I think to some extent, our universities have become a bit too beholden on Chinese student money. And so we need to find a way to have a more balanced relationship without worrying about intellectual property and without worrying about academic freedoms. And a Taiwan situation only accentuates those points. Thank you.
One of the things the Admiral Stavridis made mention of is that during the last administration, our alliances were frayed. There was not much support for our allies. And in fact, there was an emphasis to isolate the United States. Because of that, in his novel, 2034, it's the United States alone that has to fight. If you were to look at the situation today, and you're looking at our alliances, both military and the soft power, the people power, how do you see the balance? Do you think we're doing it right? Do we need to mix it up a little bit differently?
So I can give a little bit of a European perspective, having lived in the UK, and I track the French and German discussions on China. I don't think we'd be alone under this administration, because we've made a real effort to try to match the language that the Europeans have on China. China's for them has still been an economic opportunity, but Xinjiang and the concentration camps has started China down in an inevitable dead end for the Europeans. The Europeans won't stay on board for that. So we have to find a way of aligning our interests with the European interests and with the Koreans as well on, yes, we realize this would involve an economic hardship, but at the end of the day, the argument would be, It's in a collective national interest that we don't allow unification to take place by force. That's the only reason we oppose it. Of course, Taiwan and China, we don't oppose unification if it's peaceful. That would be the winning argument with our allies. We only oppose it if it's by force, and that should be hopefully successful.
But it looks like the attitude among the people in Taiwan is not unification. If we saw that poll that you took, there seemed to be a huge gap between those who consider themselves Taiwanese and those who consider themselves Chinese.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the PRC is aware that time is running out for them, because what that poll did not show is that it's the younger generation who are Taiwanese and the elderly generation who are Chinese. And so there's an aging element to that, that more and more people as they get older are becoming like, I'm Taiwanese. I've never been to China and I'm not from there. Obviously, there was still a very large percentage of people who believe they were both. It was about 40%, I believe.
Thank you. We have another question from Tyler Hironako, speaking of the younger generation. But, to this point, we've been talking about earthbound maritime routes and geopolitics and the military operation. But we know that China is also focusing on space. And is there a strategic direction by the United States to counter what China might be thinking? And how should we position what the United States wants to do versus what China is doing? So let's go to General Vares-Lum.
Absolutely. The Space Force recently, the US Space Force recently established, and this is an area definitely we saw in the investments in terms of the budget for Japan. They want to invest in that. As we go to higher capable platforms that rely on space and cyber, we have to invest in the security. And it's very clear as Japan is investing in high-end Aegis and fifth generation fighters. And you kind of saw what happened in 2034, where Admiral Stavridis looks at the future because of reliance on space and cyber. What happens? We have to go back to some of these more fundamental foundational capabilities of doing it manually, right? So I think the training on both is something that all of our services are realizing. Admiral Stavridis brings up a great point on that. But the investment on possibilities and diversifying that space piece, and not just a few, and maybe even coming to a dialogue where, I recently spoke at a Naval War College with a lot of young folks who brought up ideas about a collaborative information sharing for space and cyber. Like you said, we do a lot of this on what we know, which is maritime, air, and ground. And we have to think about this area where we can't see with our naked eye. So I think it's very important and it's critical, and we are moving in that direction together.
I have a question regarding cyber warfare. We've seen in recent weeks the ransomware shutdowns that have hit American companies by Russian players, not necessarily the Russian government, but Russian players. A couple of years ago, we had a lot of concern about what the Chinese were doing, and this would be the PLA. They've been very active. So let's take a look at the cyber threat. How bad is it, and are we prepared to meet that threat?
I think, General Nakasone with Cyber Command has been working very closely with all of our partners, allies and partners, to improve in this area. We need to be aware, I just want to make a statement. When there are Russia actors, generally, my belief is that it is connected to the government. They know exactly what they're doing, but like to have plausible deniability that they don't know, but they do. And the number of people dedicated in the PRC, units, signal units dedicated to the mapping out of our infrastructure. So this is not just a defense piece. This is critical infrastructure within our civilian government, private-public partnership, homeland security. Also, the countries in which we are basing the 54,000 US military personnel in Japan. So that partnership on that private infrastructure that we rely, energy, telecommunications, all of that piece, we have to work together to do that. And there is a wanting to speed up this process on how we can work together to make sure we have the proper defenses in place, as well as being able to hold our adversaries at risk should they decide, as a deterrence tool, I think is important. Should they decide that they are thinking of doing something that would damage our national interests, as well as that of our allies and partners.
So I have another follow-up question to that, because it's very well known that in Taiwan, there is a high degree of innovation in technology, specifically in AI, that the Chinese do not have. And that would be one reason why for China, it would be great to reunify or take over Taiwan, because they can get that technology themselves. This is technology that's very important in not only technical commercial application, but also military application. So what about that situation? Are we addressing that? And I'd like to have both General Vares-Lum and Dr. Hemmings respond to that. So start with General Vares-Lum.
Absolutely. Also supply chain issues on our technology. Taiwan plays a critical role in that piece. So, that ups the stakes in terms of the any action that the PRC decides they want to take in Taiwan from our perspective. And so, the cost, it also, the cost for us to do nothing certainly would be higher, right? So you can stand by and do nothing, or you can plan. You can plan, we can invest in capabilities, but you got to have the resolve. And I think that resolve is higher, that decision and will is higher, the more these stakes are, we shine a light on our interests and how very important Taiwan is. Dr. Hemmings, over to you.
Thank you, General Vares-Lum. I absolutely agree with you about the supply chain element is extremely important, and so many American military components and digital infrastructure rely on Taiwanese semiconductors. Actually, the semiconductor market is one that is integral, and some of the best foundries are actually in Taiwan. So it's a critical issue. And this is not a Chinese government that is ignorant of technology. In fact, Xi Jinping is extremely strategic about technology. We've had 5G, digital China strategy. We've had all the 5G Huawei and ZTE expansion into the world market. We've also had the attempts by Huawei at the International Telecommunications Union at the United Nations to kind of implement Chinese preferred standards. And so, yes, this is a nation, China is a nation that views technology as a strategic ends for itself to leapfrog the West and to become a regional hegemon. And I know that sounds kind of out of it, but I've been reading Chinese literature so much recently that's been translated for me. It's very apparent that that is the plan of Xi Jinping and the CCP, is to use those technologies to assure the party of global market, economic, and strategic control for the next century.
So technology seems to be very important. We've been talking really a lot about political warfare that the Chinese have launched, which is more of a threat and posturing. But what about the cyber warfare that they can launch? Do we have, how close is the United States to quantum supremacy? This is another question from Tyler Hironaka. Are we at the point where we have enough supremacy that we can then thwart anything that China does? Or are we at the point where, the Chinese are catching up and they might at some point surpass us? Dr. Hemmings, you want to take that on first?
Yeah, I actually, believe it or not, I'm a bit relieved by what's happening in Washington. I think both sides of the aisle have been very aware of this, what's happening. And you've seen a raising of spending in research and development. You've seen I don't want to go political, but the infrastructure plan that's been laid out by President Biden has some elements of digital infrastructure, which will empower and digitalize our economy and make us more competitive. And I know there's one eyeball on China because the Chinese are doing the same thing. They're building 5G core stations by the hundreds of thousands and trying to do Internet of Things and 5G manufacturing. So we are at the moment, I think we're a little bit neck and neck. There's some areas where we're ahead, some areas where we're behind, but they are definitely going for it. And the R&D figures that they show are very impressive. And the willingness to hoover up foreign talent by the PRC has become very apparent this year. And the willingness for companies like Huawei to, if they get blocked in one direction, for example, 5G network architecture, they just shift to cloud computing, which is where they're trying to dominate now. And so, yeah, we definitely have a good competition in front of us.
You know, the other point that I think we need to mention is Hong Kong. For many years, Hong Kong was supposed to be sort of like the capitalistic center and a different system from China, but part of China. But we see now that Hong Kong is being squashed. And is this a model that China is using to take over Taiwan? This is an observation from Leslie Ozawa again. Is China winning the PR war with Hong Kong? And is this something that would work in Taiwan? Dr. Hemmings?
Not if you ask the young Hong Kong diaspora, which are, according to the UK, which has allowed a visa program for British nationals overseas, a special category of pass. 400,000 Hong Kong citizens have applied for full living rights in the United Kingdom in 3 months. So, and they're young, they're bright, they're smart, and they liked democracy. We must remember that when Xi Jinping began to break down the one country, two systems model with the national security law, 1 million Hong Kong people flooded the streets. That's 1/7 of the city's population. So it's worth remembering that they do have a good way of manipulating the story, but the story on the streets told its own truth.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question, and this will be on something that the US business community has complained about a lot, and that is the intellectual property rights that China seems to violate, and it seems to have the upper hand in many cases. So is there a concern about that? And especially when you're talking about higher education, and again, this is from Daniel Ferguson. He references the 2019 National Defense Act, which eliminated many Confucius institutions from US. So Dr. Hemmings and General Vares-Lum.
I'll turn it over. I'll do it from the military perspective. You know, you would think this is something that has affected us greatly. You just need to look at the F-22 and then, you know, the PRC fighters. You just need to look at equipment. They have taken away years of our research and development because they have taken our, you know, intellectual property. And so now they have just leaped forward. And so wherever our commanders in the past have gone to speak to different organizations outside of the military is to bring about awareness that we need to do something. We need to be able to regain the advantage by protecting the incredible research and the brain power in our country that have realized things like Google and everything else. So, but I'll turn it over to Dr. Hemmings with that.
Such an interesting question, and it's so Daniel Ferguson, I absolutely empathize. It's depressing because we had this kind of post-Cold War liberal global academic order, and it's breaking down. I recommend that you read Alex Joske from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Bees Making Honey, about how the PRC has been sending out military officers to graduate schools that do STEM subjects in the West particularly UK, Australia, and the United States, to essentially work on synthetic materials, rocket engines, UAVs, and they do not identify as officers of the military, and they're part of a program that sent hundreds of thousands of people abroad, and they're essentially diluting academic training for what is a state-sponsored attempt to leapfrog a authoritarian power ahead of a bunch of democracies. So yeah, I think we have to fight racism in universities and make sure that this doesn't become ever tainted by the accusations of any of our Chinese scholars or American Chinese scholars that are based in the West. But we also have to remember that the ones who are being sent by the party are not worth our defense, because what they're doing is essentially working against the very democracies that are supporting them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That takes us to the hour mark. In fact, we're just a few minutes long, but it's been such an interesting discussion. We really appreciate General Vares-Lum and Dr. Hemmings for your insightful comments and providing us a very comprehensive overview of where we are today. Hopefully.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for moderating today. Thank you very, very much, General Vares-Lum and Dr. Hemmings, for enlightening our audience on the current state of affairs in East Asia and the entire Indo-Pacific region. Lots to think about. Hour, but lots to really think about. So thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge and information. We really appreciate that. And thank you to our guests today, our audience, for spending this time with us the last hour and for your thought-provoking questions. We really do appreciate your participation. And please, I encourage you to let us know if you'd like to hear and see more of this type of discussion through JASH, or anything you would like to hear through JASH. As you know, our mission is to really support a stronger alliance between the US and Japan, and whatever way we can. This is one way, and information and knowledge is really important. And so please let us know. We're here. Please contact us and let us know. So anyway, we're over time. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you to Barbara, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mahalo.
Bye.